All right, what's going on, everyone? So today we're going to take a look at a Bellingcat investigation that looks into the possibility that Israel is committing domicide in Gaza. Now, domicide is not a term that you see often, don't hear it a lot. One of the reasons for that is that it's not called out specifically in the Geneva Conventions. The idea of domicide is the deliberate destruction of homes or property so that a group of people cannot return there after the cessation of hostilities. Now, there's a lot of debate right now, and has been for a long time, that domicide should be included formally by name in the Geneva Conventions or listed as a war crime so that countries could be held responsible if they pursue this tactic. Again, domicide in itself, not technically a war crime, but there's aspects within the existing law of war that could apply to this. You know, the deliberate targeting of civilians or taking reprisals against a civilian population and so on. So this article, I'm going to go ahead and link in the description below. It's worth running through in its entirety, but rather than just pull out some screenshots and little snippets, I thought we'd run through it start to finish here together. So it's titled, "We Become Addicted to Explosions, the IDF Unit Responsible for Demolishing Homes Across Gaza." And there's quite a few satellite images as well as videos that they relay throughout. So they say that systematic and widespread attacks on civilian housing and infrastructure in Gaza has been described as domicide. Again, a UN representative called it. He said, even with attacks against individual buildings, every building which is bombed or destroyed has to be evaluated legally, whether a building on this or that corner of a road needed to be destroyed or not. The burden is on the IDF to show that they have evidence, that they have proof that the attack is proportionate and necessary. And this is a nuanced piece of this investigation and this conversation is buildings are destroyed in war. It happens. It's the nature of the beast. Good luck finding a war throughout history where civilian infrastructure was not destroyed or damaged. That's going to happen. But destroying a civilian building is not in of itself a war crime. What they have to look at in this case, if they're heading that direction, is the deliberate continued targeting of civilian infrastructure, destruction of civilian infrastructure that doesn't serve a deliberate military purpose. All right, so keep that in the back of your mind. Again, the idea that any building being destroyed is a war crime is far from the truth. That's going to happen, and that's not what we're getting into here. So they say, behind each ruined building, each demolished minaret, each pile of rubble, there is a decision and an action which has been carried out by a specific unit or person. And the unit that they follow here is 8219 Commando, as they moved across Gaza, demolishing tunnels, houses, and mosques. This is a combat engineering battalion. There's multiple combat engineering battalions that have been used throughout the war in Gaza. There's nothing necessarily unique about this unit other than, and we'll get into this here in a minute, they supposedly have destroyed more homes in Gaza than any other organization. That is their own words being used there. In going through this investigation, Bellingcat says they use statements from the organization as well as satellite imagery before and after, and then videos and pictures published to social media and then through some official IDF channels. So we're going to start with some of the detonations here. And I wanted to, well, it helps to start with this one because it provides some examples. They say no justification for this demolition was given in the post, but there can be justifications for the demolishing of a home. And I've talked about this in recent videos where Hamas has continued to claim responsibility for setting off house-borne IEDs. They rig homes with explosives, and then when Israeli soldiers move inside to clear that facility, they detonate it and they kill, 4, 5, 6 Israeli soldiers in the process. This is something, a tactic that we saw play out through portions of Syria and Iraq under Islamic State. And what happened, if you look at Mosul, Raqqa, and other cities throughout that fight, is eventually entire buildings just started being leveled. Because you think about this from in this case, the Israeli perspective. If you send all of your troops into a building to clear it out one by one, and one of those buildings blows up when you have a squad inside and you lose some of your soldiers, the next building you move into, if you start to see tripwires or explosive charges in the corner or exposed wires somewhere suggesting there might be charges in this home, you got to think that the idea of just leveling this house, detonating this entire home, moves up on the possibility list, if you will, right? It's entirely possible that what we're seeing here with this home was the first floor had multiple IEDs strewn throughout. The second floor had multiple fighting positions. There was a tunnel entrance into a Hamas underground network. That could be the case here, right? The other side of that is the nature of one house being rigged with explosives does not mean that you can then look at every other house in the nature of that operation during the course of that operation and say, well, remember that one had explosives? That means all of them can be blown up right now. That is the kind of thing that wouldn't play out should this type of investigation move forward to something like the International Criminal Court. This one here is hard to explain the rationale, and we're going to see a couple like this. They say this is between November 20th and 23rd. The battalion participated in multiple demolitions of residential tower blocks immediately next to the Al-Quds Hospital in Gaza City. So that first one we showed was an individual home, and you could understand how an individual home in a place like Gaza that Hamas has fortified over the years could be some sort of fighting position, or they could use it to stage out of to conduct attacks against Israeli forces. There's a lot of possibilities there, right, with the one home. It's very hard to understand an entire multi-story building like this, let alone multiple of these apartment-looking buildings next to each other. I want to add the caveat here that for a lot of these, there was either limited or no public explanation by Israel as to why this detonation was carried out. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means that it wasn't made public if it does. But it's hard, again, it's hard to understand the justification when you're talking about the necessary use of force as to why 5, 6, 7 apartment buildings are worth dropping entirely, right? And again, these aren't bombs falling from overhead. These are soldiers moved into that area, rigged up these explosives by hand. So it's not as though that there were 400 Hamas militants holed up throughout these structures, because those Israeli forces would have come under fire as they were setting the charges. Just this is the kind of thing that I imagine we're going to see more of it throughout this video, is going to be hard for Israel to justify going forward. And we see another view. I think this is a different set of buildings, but the same concept here, whether it's the same or different. Multiple apartment-looking buildings destroyed. Again, what is the rationale for doing that? The military justification for doing that. Again, to take it back a second, there are situations where you have to, when you look at it from the law of war perspective, there's the proportionality discussion, which is challenging for sure. But if there were Hamas militants holed up in one of these buildings and Israel decided to drop a couple 2,000-pound bombs on it and it leveled the entire building, there's at least that argument there of it was providing a military space for hostile forces that were actively engaging our troops. It's hard to see that when you're laying explosive charges at the base of these buildings to bring them down. A couple more here. Just, again, multiple high-rise buildings, if you will, being brought down with explosive charges. And I'll link the I'll link this kind of presentation, if you will, I think is a way to put it, kind of interactive presentation in the description below, so you can scroll through it at your own pace. This is a before and after for one of the areas. You're going to see a little bit of a change here. There's another before and after later that I think is much more telling. They say in this one, at least 34 residential housing blocks were either completely or partially destroyed during this time, some as many as 10 stories high. It's a lot of homes being destroyed, right? And then the argument here for this Domicide piece is that that is being done deliberately so that Palestinians cannot move back into their homes whenever hostilities cease. We're going to get a couple Facebook posts, if you will, from Israeli soldiers that are going to be brought up here. This one talks about the justification for detonating one of these houses. They say in the parking lot of the third building were parked 2 white transits. In one, there was a hidden compartment under the seat with means of producing IEDs. In the second, it took a lot of time to break into. We found missiles ready to launch and a small UAV ready to cruise in the air for terrorist purposes. In a small warehouse behind these vehicles were dozens of rockets ready to fire on citizens of the state of Israel, arranged in man-made iron uprights. This is one of those little nuanced pieces you have to take into consideration in a war zone. If a complex is deemed being used for military purposes, there is a justification to remove that capability from your enemy going forward. That said, if this was a 10-story apartment building and they found a couple rockets and a small UAV on the first floor, you see how that doesn't really line up as justified to bring down the entire apartment complex because of a few IED components in the front yard. And that's the kind of... So early on, one of the guys they quoted from the UN said this has to be determined case by case. And that's why, right? A small shed on the outskirts of Gaza City housing all this stuff, sure, get rid of it. But when you're talking about a 10-story building, it's a bit of a different story. A few more buildings here showing additional destruction throughout Gaza, of course. This one I wanted to hit on. They were talking about a mosque that was destroyed, and this has always been a touchy subject in this war and in all wars, but I wanted to provide a little kind of personal context to this one here. So they say a mosque and an adjacent building were demolished. An Instagram post depicting this mosque being prepared for demolition claimed that, quote, "Every house, mosque, and school has been used here for terrorist purposes, either as a place for terrorists, an explosive warehouse, or a military base." That statement right there does not justify the targeting of protected buildings, right? The fact that previously hospitals or mosques were used and have been used, and we've seen that documented throughout the war in Gaza, that does not mean that every one of them becomes a legitimate target. It doesn't work like that. Again, case-by-case basis. Now, that might mean that Israel is approaching some of these buildings with more caution, recognizing that in the past they have been either fighting positions, held Hamas fighters, etc. But you can't automatically say, well, that mosque or 5 mosques in a row held weapons, so number 6 must hold weapons. Automatically, it's on the target list. Drop it. It doesn't work like that. We got another picture here showing the mosque having been destroyed, and I wanted to share a personal story here. This is, again, one use case, does not apply to the entire U.S. military, and it's a different war, different time, all these things. But when I was in Afghanistan, we would regularly come across mosques, abandoned mosques, if you will, in portions of Kandahar that were being used to store IED components or IEDs, weapons, radios, all sorts of things. They were very clearly staging points for Taliban fighters in the area, an area where we were getting shot at every single day. So it wasn't surprising at all that they were using some of these mosques to stage out of. We never once targeted a mosque for demolition because of that. I don't know that that was necessarily the perfect or the wrong answer, whatever it might be. The rationale there was the blowback from destroying a religious structure can be so severe that you just really got to walk on pins and needles before you actually take that step to destroy a religious structure or a school or a hospital, whatever it might be. In those cases, over and over again, we were finding IEDs stored in mosques. But again, the destruction of that mosque could have had such significant ramifications for not just our forces, but all allied forces in the region, that it was every single time deemed not necessary to destroy that entire facility, even though it very clearly, time and again, lost its protected status. Continuing on, we got the mosque being blown up here, and I want to shift down to Khan Yunis, actually. So this is the second part of, I will call it, this group's deployment, shifting in and around the southern city of Khan Yunis. And this one's interesting because it shifts from, let me go back up here a little bit, it shifts from Gaza City in the central portion, kind of right in the middle of the northern Gaza Strip. And then down here to Khan Yunis, you end up right on the border with Israel. And that's going to be important as we get into some of this. So they talk about multiple buildings in this case, in this small area. And the before and after here is going to be pretty crazy to see just the extent of this damage. It talks about how there were explosives and then bulldozers came in to kind of level this whole area. And this, of course, we've got the video from the top of the header of this article, if you will. There's a lot of videos showing the destruction in this area. And this is some of the ones I remember a lot of these videos coming out because it went from individual buildings being destroyed to like entire blocks, it looked like, going up at the same time. Pretty significant explosions. The big one at night here. One after the other, after the other, after the other, right? All right, then we get into this before and after in the Khan Yunis area, which I think is much more telling than the one further north. So we've got December 2023, and then look at that, January 2024. It's like the entire area is just laid to waste, right? Like city blocks just destroyed. Then we get into some of the justifications, or maybe I should say the reasons as to why these attacks took place. In a Facebook post, again, putting this information out publicly, an IDF officer said, "The IDF in a special effort decided to take land from the enemy and through us destroy the village of the murderers. After we blow up about 150 buildings, the bulldozers come and level the area in order to bring the fence closer and reduce the enemy's area by 1.5 kilometers. All of that is not in line with the law of war. That is illegal. You can't do that. You can't take land from the adversary to create an additional buffer zone. Now, this is the kind of statement that's been made publicly. It's now been documented, and I would expect if this moves forward into some sort of formal investigation by the ICC or others, it's statements like this, they're going to be called out and pointed to. Something to keep in mind here in this case is this is a captain of the unit. This is the captain's understanding of what happened. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was the orders given or the overall military intent, right? It could go either way. This is not me trying to make an assessment of what that means. It's just this is how the captain interpreted that. That could also be the direct orders he received, at which point that information will come out, and that's significant. It also could be the Israeli captain's interpretation of a different set of priorities, and maybe just he viewed it that way. So something to keep in mind as this goes forward. We've got another neighborhood in Khan Yunis here, and in this one they talked about using 300 mines to destroy this building. Massive explosion. It's not normal for a conventional military to use landmines like this to detonate buildings. We have a lot of explosives on hand to do that are more controllable. You have a better understanding of how that blast is going to play out. It's a little bit unusual to see landmines used in that type of operation. And then we got a before and after here. You can see, again, it's the entire building and a couple around it look like they were just completely destroyed in that blast. And then coming from the unit, they put out a page or a video talking about what they accomplished during their time in Gaza. This is normal for military units. The United States did this, again, regularly whenever we brought units back from Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere. They say in their video, they say that over 84 days of fighting, they destroyed 49 tunnels and 662 buildings. They say, I think we are the unit, at least until we left, that blew up the most amount of houses in Gaza. So again, when you're talking about what's unique about this organization that is followed in this study, it's that right there. They're saying in their own words that they destroyed more homes than anyone else as they moved through Gaza. The captain of the unit himself said that the battalion commander came to visit us. Again, public post on Facebook. Came to visit us for a few minutes today. He said that we have already stopped counting the number of buildings the battalion blew up. Can't count anymore. There's no precedent for it in all the activity in the years of the IDF, and he's willing to put his name to it. So again, the destruction of homes in a war zone is not a war crime. The deliberate destruction of homes in order to inflict retribution or to prevent a civilian population from returning after hostilities, that would be considered a war crime. Another aspect here worth mentioning is they talk about how some of this, getting at the rationale, why it was conducted or not. They did quote some people, again, public posts on Facebook, talking about how this was done out of revenge for Israelis that had been killed. We're talking about when you look at why buildings are destroyed and why they can be or can't be destroyed, revenge is one of those where they cannot be destroyed because of revenge. All right, has to have a military necessity, and revenge is not a military necessity. There were also some aspects here talking about, gets into the nuance of what is revenge. Other aspects, here we go, talking about a religious aspect, saying that using the 400 mines to demolish a residential area in honor of the Shabbat. So again, this is the kind of thing, I'm not a lawyer, this is the kind of thing that would get into those type of proceedings, pulling all this information out to say, what is the justification, what is the rationale behind this level of destruction seen in Gaza? And then getting into, again, the UN representative that talked about this idea of domicide and what it could mean. You can understand where that comes from, right? It's kind of like a backdoor way to genocide, where you say, if somebody were to say, we're not actually going to kill the people, we're just going to raise their land to where they can't come back here, it kind of, it ends up with the same thing. It ends up with a degree of ethnic cleansing, maybe even genocide. So you can understand why this domicide there's a lot of push to get it kind of brought in formally to something like the Geneva Conventions or the International Law of War. But again, they hit on here how this land grab, clearing a buffer area by the fence, that's not okay. You can't do that. That would violate the law of war. And again, a lot of this has to do with how, when you look at the intent, why are these destructions taking place? This is something that Israel is going to have to prove. There's more and more information coming out talking about this, right? And in every one of these cases, it's not enough to say, again, that house down the street had IEDs, so we blew this house up. As mentioned at the very beginning of this article, every single facility, every single building is technically viewed on an individual basis. Now, it's too much to believe that every single one of these homes will see some sort of investigation after the war. That's just not realistic. The manpower is not there. It's too messy. Just Don't expect that, not by a long shot. But there are some notable ones here. When you're talking about 10-story apartment buildings being hit and being filmed and recorded and documented, there probably will be some questions about that. And it'll be interesting to see how that all comes to light. And again, I'll link the report in the description below if you want to check it out on your own time and scroll through a little slower maybe than I was and look at these pictures a little more in depth. That's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.